LeaderEthics-Wisconsin, Lee Roche, for our presentation on ethical leadership in the American democracy.
Well, good morning to everyone. Looks like it is going to be a pleasant spring day out there today. I hope you have an opportunity to spend some time and enjoy it. And thank you for being part of the program today. The focus is to give you some information that will be thought-provoking. Some of it may be concerning that the conditions that we're talking about are present, but I'm hoping that you will end with the belief that there are actually good actions that we can take, should take, and that we can be hopeful that we can be instilling ethical leadership in the American democracy. Let me start out by switching screens here real quick. And okay, I hope it's coming up clearly for you. So the focus of ethical leadership in American democracy, it really started in conversations that I've been having with many community leaders, actually in the La Crosse area, but actually all throughout the state. I had over 50 conversations about these issues, and it led to the formation of the organization LeaderEthics-Wisconsin. And so I'll go provide some background information about some of the things that we talked about. And this is the thing that really struck us clearly, is that how often we heard from people that we love our country, but we just don't trust our government. And that's an interesting thing, because our government is our country, as well as all the people in it. And so it's interesting the way we were able to segment that. And it wasn't always the case. In fact, if you look at this information that's done by Pew Research, they've been tracking the trust and confidence in government now since the late 1950s. And you can see in the Eisenhower-Kennedy years, well over 75% of Americans had trust in government in Washington, always or most of the time. And you can see how that has fallen off over the years. We had a resurgence in trust following the 9/11 attacks. And then now in the last two presidencies, we're at a low point in the 60 plus years that they've been doing the survey. And here's another way of looking at this information as well. This is based on the Gallup survey on our trust in occupations. And you can see nurses and medical doctors and pharmacists and teachers are all very trustful. And then you go down the list, you start seeking toward the bottom, and you see that members of Congress are actually down there below car salespeople and telemarketers. And so why is that? What is causing us to have such a distrustful view of people who are elected officials? I think there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, we are a nation that is divided at this time. And that's not unusual for our country. In fact, if you lived through the Vietnam War era, you know that we were very divided at that time. And then a little over 100 years before that, we were embroiled in a civil war. So the conflict in our country isn't new, but the difference is that in many ways, at this time, we are a nation divided by design. What do you think I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at some of the things that are going on right now. First of all, we are involved in something now where technology is playing such a major role in everything that we're doing. And it is accelerating everything that we're doing. And it means that when there is misinformation or disinformation is distributed 100 years ago, 50 years ago, it didn't have the benefit or our disadvantage of the impact that technology can have. For example, in the election, there was a report made to the United States Senate Intelligence Committee on election interference by the Internet Research Agency, the IRA. Now, the IRA is actually the Russian entity based out of St. Petersburg that was putting out a campaign of disinformation, not only in the United States and the American election, but other places in Europe as well. And the things that they were doing were introducing controversial issues on fabricated pages on social media. Essentially, they're blaming both sides. They weren't trying to elect one person or unelect someone else. They're basically trying to erode our confidence in the electoral process. They often used minority populations in this framing because they felt that that was a hot button that they could push. I remember seeing on my Facebook screen the image of a young African-American woman standing on an American flag. And of course, what that was trying to do is really trip some triggers for many people in our country. But here's the thing. Their report found that between 2015 and 2017, over 31 million Americans liked and shared the IRA's fabricated Facebook and Instagram posts. Now, what's the prognosis for 2020? Well, this is what the Shorenstein Center is predicting, that we're going to continue to see disinformation campaigns. Unlike in 2016, the majority are projected to come from within the United States. In other words, people in our country have learned from some of the tools and techniques that happen from elsewhere in the world. That we need to be on the alert for deep fake video technology. This is essentially the technology that allows someone to alter the words that are coming out of a video image, and they're replicating the tone and matching the speech patterns, and essentially they're putting words into someone else's mouth. And this is something that at one time was pretty sophisticated, not so much anymore. And it can be something that could really have an impact on in the 11th hour on election if there's something that is put into someone's words that is controversial. This is another view of some of those things that the Stern Center pointed out, and it's also projected that this is going to be a for-profit business for people in getting involved in the upcoming election. So let's take a look at this issue of the political divide, and we talk about division by design. This is what Pew Research has been finding in their analysis of the differences between the Republican Party and the members of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And if you look at this, when they started tracking this in 1994, the median Democrat or median Republican was really pretty close. And even in 2004, you could still see that the differences between the two parties was not that great. Look what's happened starting in their 2014 analysis. And you can see that there's some significant differences now. And this is where they show we are based on their 2017 report. As you can see how challenging it is to try to bring people together, because we're starting at a place that is so far apart. And if we're thinking of ethical leaders as someone who's trying to bring people together, you could see what the challenges are. Here's another way of looking at this information as well. So what Pew Research did is they tried to determine, well, why are we becoming more divided at this time? And so they were asking questions and trying to profile whether what the factors might be. For example, they tracked race or religious attendance or education or age or gender. And what they found is that those factors had virtually no impact on the growing divide. The one variable that significantly had an impact was political party loyalty. In fact, right now, their most recent report shows that we're indeed divided as parties. And essentially what they found is that if among Republicans, The significant majority believes that Republican policies are good for the country and Democratic policies are harmful for the country. 76% and 71% believe that. Among Democrats, they believe, 72% believe that Democratic policies are good for the country and Republican policies are harmful, 63%. And so you can see it's not just a belief in one's political party, but it's a significant opposition, strong opposition to the other party. Okay, so here's a question. So what if we're divided? Is that a bad thing? Is there anything that says that we have to be a unified country? Well, here's another way of looking at that information. There's an organization called the Bipartisan Policy Center. And in fact, I'd recommend that you check them out on the web because you'll find that they have some pretty interesting articles about bipartisan policy strategies. But what they did is they developed something that's called the Healthy Congress Index. And they found out that there are 8 key variables that you can track that give you an indication on how well members of Congress are working together or just working. For example, they track the working days this Congress is scheduled and how many days do individual members of Congress actually show up for work. That how many bills go through committee instead of being introduced on the floor. How many of those bills allow for amendments or allow for filibuster or cloture, which are sometimes can be frustrating, but in reality, they're an opportunity for the minority party to have their voice heard. How many in the Senate bills are introduced that allow for the amendments to be introduced as well? How many pieces of legislation actually go to conference committees where a version passes the House, another version passes the Senate, and they form a conference committee to work out the differences. Then they track how congressional oversight is being handled. And what they mean here is that most major pieces of legislation like the Higher Education Act or the workforce or the agriculture bill have a 5-year authorization, and how many of those major pieces of legislation are reauthorized on time. And then the final area, the budget appropriations process, basically they're tracking how do we avoid having a government shutdown. And so what we did is we looked at that information and we went through the years 2017 and through 2018, and we looked at the pattern that was happening in those 8 areas. And what we found is that 5 of the 8 have a declining pattern. In other words, we're doing worse today in those 5 areas than we were in 2007. 3 of them are the status quo. They're about the same, but one of the status quo, the budget appropriations process, the government shutdown issue, we weren't doing well in 2007 either. So there's no change in that. So the argument here is that a divided Congress isn't going to be more effective at addressing issues that the country needs or the citizens are needing. So as our trust in government is eroded, so are expectations for leadership performance as well. And if we think about this, this is where I think the American people are saying we're concerned about this, and this is something we should try to do something about. For example, this is another Pew Research study, 85% Americans feel that the political debate has become less respectful, fact-based, and substantive, and more negative. In fact, 85% less respectful, less fact-based, 76%, less focused on issues, 60%. But here's an interesting thing. More than 1 out of 3 Americans think our political process is more entertaining today. So think about this in the context of that that chart that showed the trust in occupations, because we value ethical leadership in business and healthcare and education. For example, if you're familiar with the book by Jim Collins, Good to Great, he studied high-performing, long-term successful businesses. And what they found is they all had what he called character-based leaders, or servant leaders, people who were really focused on supporting customers and employees and their colleagues as their first priority. The National Malcolm Baldrige Quality Award looks at high-performing organizations, and the winners of the Malcolm Baldrige Award all have band 4, level 4 leaders, in other words, character-based leaders. And of course, there are many companies and organizations that are embracing the concept of servant leadership. We're fortunate in the La Crosse area to have the Turbo University's leadership in that program by having a master's degree program available. So if you think about this, if you're in business or in education or in healthcare, you can learn how to become an ethical leader. There are programs and resources. If you were in a hiring position, if you were on a board for an organization like this, you could recruit and try to hire someone who met those criteria. Another way of looking at this is when you do business in your community with a locally owned company, you buy services or goods, you expect that the leaders of that organization to be ethical leaders. When your children go to school, you expect that the school administrators will be ethical leaders. The question is, why don't we expect elected officials, political leaders, to be ethical leaders? So how do we start on changing that perception? Well, I think it comes down to some initial key points of understanding. First of all, we need to recognize that ethical leadership is not tied to any political party. You can be strong in your beliefs and you can be supportive of your party's positions, but you can choose to approach your position from an ethical perspective in either case. It's also important to recognize that ethical leadership performance isn't tied to policy either. You can be passionate about a political issue, a legislative issue, and really firm in your beliefs, but you can your approach to addressing, advancing your position on those policies can be ethical, or it can be very deceptive and unethical in its approach. Secondly, we believe that ethical leaders consistently demonstrate 4 characteristics. They're truthful, they're transparent with public information, they're unifiers rather than dividers, and they're willing to represent the collective interest of their constituency. In other words, they're not taking sides and supporting one group of constituents over others. In fact, they need to also recognize there are people that are their constituents that can't even vote because they're underage or some other variable, and yet they deserve representation as well. So why do we in this organization focus on ethical leadership rather than the broader umbrella of ethics and morality? And certainly we have laws on the books now regarding ethical behavior, and usually they have to do with avoiding theft or fraud or things along those lines. And what we do is we focus on the area of ethical leadership. There's a concept, it actually came out of the business schools in the 1980s, but it's pretty well utilized everywhere now. And it refers to political silos and turf wars. And I'm sure if you haven't worked in an organization where you had political silos and turf wars, you probably know of one because they're very common. They're a challenge. In fact, on a personal note, before I came to my position as president at Western Technical College, I was a senior leader at a college in the Chicago area, and quite candidly, they had some ethical challenges in the way they marketed their programs and some of their hiring practices. And And so when it came to lacrosse and my position here, I really wanted to learn more about this issue of how do you help organizations be better at working together and not battling from within. By the way, in a silo mentality, the people at the top of the organization are locking horns, the people in the middle of the organization are locking horns, and the people on the front line are locking horns. In fact, if you ask one department, what does this company or organization need to do to improve? They will say, well, the other side has to do something. They've got to do it better. They have to do things first. And so essentially this finger pointing goes back and forth. And the idea is it starts at the top and it continues all the way through. So one of the things I wanted to learn more about is how do you counter that? And so in my own personal research on this, I found that, first of all, there needs to be more study. But what I found that there are some things that really are critically important for leaders in order to counter this. For example, an ethical leader can set expectations that we will work together. They'll recognize that we can't be a successful company or organization if we're blaming the other half of the organization for problems. They'll reward or reinforce teamwork and behavior along those lines. They will find ways to address problem areas. In fact, they might even remove people if they refuse to work well together. They can set a compelling vision, a very compelling direction that we all need to follow because it's in our organizational and our personal and our collective interest to do that. And so leaders can really be the key to trying to bring an organization together. But a couple other things they found in our research is that even when you do those things, you have to keep reinforcing them. You have to reinforce the importance of that mission. And you have to constantly be checking on how the organization is doing. So you're constantly trying to pull the organization together. You may never get it completely together because of human nature. It's a challenge and people will be maybe argumentative or disagreeable at times. But you've got to keep working at it. But here's the thing that they found. If the leader of the organization is ignoring conflict or contributing to conflict, all hell breaks loose. In other words, all that hard work is bringing the organization together. The payoff is that you're accomplishing some things that are worthwhile, but the alternative is so much more destructive. And the thing about in the political arena, we elect representatives, but our leaders, our elected officials are role models. And we look at the things that they do and they have an influence on us as citizens. That silo mentality that I'm referring to, it doesn't just happen in organizations, it happens in our everyday lives if we allow it to. So, what can you do? Well, here's some suggestions. First of all, there are some big things we could do. And I like to share this story because this shows what average citizens can do if they really want to take on a challenging issue in a state. In this case, the state of North Dakota is dominated by the government is dominated by one political party. They have a supermajority, which means that their bills that are passed are veto-proof, and they have a very poor reputation for transparency. There are concerns within the state that they are too cozy with certain facets of business, and as a result of that, there are some real concerns about legal misbehavior that's going on. In fact, they were ranked by a national organization as near the bottom of the 50 states in the area of transparency. So a group of citizens got together. They call themselves the Badass Grandmas of North Dakota. They actually they have roots in both the Democratic and the Republican Party. And they were determined to try to do something to address this issue of transparency. They did a lot of surveying, and they had, they met with church groups and citizens groups just to try to gather as much information that they possibly could on the options that they should be pursuing. And what they found is that there were many ideas, but 3 or 4 really surfaced as the primary ones. And so there needed to be improved laws on transparency, and they really needed to have an ethics commission so that there was a neutral party that could citizens could go to, legislators could go to, others could go to try to have an impartial and ethical determination on an issue. So they drafted an amendment to the state's constitution, and they brought that issue for a vote in the fall of 2018. Now, you can imagine that there were a lot of people in the existing government that wanted to maintain the status quo. In fact, in the campaign leading up to the vote, they were outspent in advertising by more than 10 to 1. In fact, there were some estimates it was probably closer to 20 to 1. But the legislation passed, and it showed that average citizens can take steps and make a difference if they work together, and it's for an important cause, a good cause. Now, there are other things that we can do too, and there's something on our website we call the 2020 Citizens Guide to Ethical Leadership Among Elected Officials. It's the 1.0 version. We're working on the 2.0 version right now by gathering some information and ideas on actions we can take. And so the things that we're looking for are practical ideas that average citizens can take to try to promote ethical leadership, to try to encourage elected officials to be truthful, to be transparent with public information, to function as unifiers, and to represent their entire constituency. And so here are some examples of the things that we have included in that Citizens Guide. We identified questions regarding those 4 ethical leadership principles, suggested questions that you could ask. So think about what's coming up in fall of 2020. We have a number of people running for office. They could be local offices. They could be candidates for state office. And many of us will have an opportunity to attend a public forum. And so if you have an opportunity to ask a question, you can certainly ask a question about an important policy, but you could also ask a question such as, if you were elected to this office, how will you represent your entire constituency, not just the simple majority that voted for you? Now, the purpose of asking a question like that, particularly if you can do that in a public setting, is that you can help expand the awareness of how important it is to be an ethical leader and as a representative for your entire constituency. So we have suggested questions for those other areas as well. We also have some ideas that we wanted to share about social media. And when you saw the problem we had in 2016 with the IRA, you can see why this is really a vital area of concern for many people. So we offer some practical suggestions. First of all, it's important to recognize that social media companies, their whole business model is built around enticing people to share their likes and dislikes. In other words, share their data. And now, you may not think it's a bad thing to let that social media company know that you love your grandchildren. But when we disclose other pieces of information, and then that information can be shared elsewhere throughout the internet, it can have really a compounding effect. It's really problematic when you're liking and sharing something that is disinformation, a fabricated story. It's important to remember this. We don't have to like or share anything. And we should think about that carefully when we're on social media so that what we're doing is not contributing to a problem. Here's something that I have done when I see a fabricated story or a story that I feel is fabricated. I may not have time to research it, but if there's evidence there that it might be a false story or an altered story, I would put in the comments that it'll be a statement such as this. Basically, I'll say, we should realize that many media sources or news sources on social media may look like they're official sources of information, but they're really fabricated and are a facade, and the purpose is to try to divide the American citizenry. When I sense that to be the case, I choose not to like or share information about that. Now, when I put a comment like that forward, I know I'm not going to persuade the source of that story to change their opinion. I'm not planning to out-debate the internet, but I am able to reach out to people that are really friends or family members, real friends, people that I know and respect, and they may know and respect me as well. In fact, I received comments back from people saying, I'm glad you put that comment forward because I didn't realize that how this could work if we just automatically let our emotions get us and we hit that send button and we send it out there, how that just cascades throughout the whole social media system. One of the things we include in our Citizens Guide are some of the other organizations that we like that are committed to better government. First of all, this is a very small list of a much larger list. And it's encouraging to know that many people are trying to improve the facets of the way the American democracy is operating and hopefully will survive and thrive. Ballotpedia gives you a lot of good information about issues and how votes have gone. And if you want to study positions on what is happening in other states on a similar issue, you can go to Ballotpedia and you can find something. Better Angels is now called Braver Angels. And they were formed in 2006 following the national election and the division that was in place in the state of Ohio at that time. And they developed the process for bringing together people who have strong political views, strong conservative views, strong liberal views, and put them through a process to try to help them better understand, become better listeners, better understand how this process is working that is dividing us and how they can counter it. In fact, there's a Braver Angels event that's available tomorrow evening, and it's co-sponsored with the Greater La Crosse United Way and an organization called BE, as well as LeaderEthics-Wisconsin. There's information on our website if you're interested in learning more about that. We like the Bipartisan Policy Center. In fact, many people aren't aware that there is actually some major legislation that was passed regarding reforms in the criminal justice system. And at a time when it seems like the parties just couldn't work together at all, they were able to get some successful legislation through. There's also a group that's working on, a bipartisan group that is working in Congress on procedures and practices to improve transparency and efficiency. And actually, it's really encouraging because the leadership in both the Senate and the House, in both parties, is supporting the work that's coming forward. NCIV is a Madison organization that promotes civility. FAIR is another organization that is trying to present a balanced overview of issues and policies. Institute for Civility and Government also promotes practices that promote civility. VoteSmart is a tremendous amount of data that's available on campaign funds raised or voting records, just a variety of really, really insightful things about candidates and incumbents and their elected actions. We also like to talk about these two organizations because they're really good sources for analyzing the media. And there are also fact-checking organizations too, and I encourage you to check Snopes and PolitiFact and some of the other organizations that are out there. But these two organizations are analyzing and rating the media. All sides, they study the patterns of over 300 different media sources. They rank them from the conservative range to the liberal range, or in the middle of the road area. So you get a sense of who your favorite media sources are and where they fit in on that spectrum. They also will occasionally take articles and they will promote versions from the different parts of the spectrum. So you kind of get a 3D view of an issue, the conservative view of that issue, the liberal view, and the moderate view, and so on. And then they ask their subscribers to rate their performance. So they want to make sure that they're checking themselves and that what they're doing is current, and that they aren't sliding into a form of their own bias in their ratings. The second entity is called Media Bias Fact Check, MBFC, and they actually do ratings on over 3,000 different media sources worldwide. If you want to see how a newspaper is doing in our state and ratings, they'll probably have something there. It's kind of interesting. But they do it a little differently. So they do categorize media sources by conservative, they call it right or right center. In the middle, they don't say moderate, they say least biased. And they also rate organizations that are promoting a scientific study or satire, or maybe organizations that promote conspiracy theories or things that tend to be or look like conspiracy theories. And essentially what they're doing is giving you an opportunity to go to one site and you can find out where did this story come from and how reliable is that source. By the way, Media Bias Fact Check also fact checks the fact checkers. And so it's really a really interesting way to take some information and get a better understanding on what your preferences are, your media patterns are, and how you can become better informed. By the way, both of these organizations, they clearly state all media has bias. So what they're trying to do is not trying to change your opinions, they're trying to help better educate all of us as consumers of media. This is the information on the last Braver Angels event that is going on. And this idea about learning how to develop a better understanding, of, I call them tools and practices, things that you can do to try to become a better listener. They also even focus on how we can become better communicators with people, not just the people who we might have a different opinion or a disagreeable opinion from our view, but also people who are like-minded, because there are things that we can do when we're around people that we consider our friends and colleagues, like-minded friends and colleagues, that actually kind of amps up that political divide that we're seeing. I really like this issue of reaching out to the next generation of ethical leaders. And we're fortunate in La Crosse, at UW La Crosse, that there's a student organization called Students for Ethical Leadership Within Government, SELG. This came about because students were raising some of the same questions that people in our community are raising. And the process of change is really it's gonna hinge on all of us, but it's really gonna be important to have the next generation become the champions for ethical leadership. If you belong to a service group and you're looking for speakers, why don't you invite an SELG member to come in and talk about what they're doing to promote ethical leadership? I think you'd find it interesting. And then I want to encourage you to support LeaderEthics-Wisconsin and lend your voice to the process. This is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization and we're committed to promoting ethical leadership among elected officials. If you become a member, membership is pretty affordable, we believe. It's $25 a year to become a member, and $10 a year if you're age 23 or younger. You'll, on a monthly basis, you'll receive something called the Ethics Report, which is citing examples of good ethical leadership in practice among elected leaders, and some examples that are, quite candidly, not so good. We survey our members to try to get their feedback on what they're seeing and their impression of ethical leadership performance. And in order to check ourselves, prior to the ethics report going out, it's reviewed by a panel of judges to make sure that we don't have some unintended bias. And our panel of judges members are actually 3 retired judges. I talked a little bit about the organization and our fee structure. We have quarterly events, and now, as you can imagine, we're holding events online, and this allows us to bring in some really insightful and talented speakers to share their stories. We've had former elected leaders talk about former state senator Brian Rood, for example, talked about countering political tribalism. We had speakers give suggestions on internet literacy and social media and fighting disinformation. We've had speakers from business who talked about their focus on techniques and practices to promote ethical leadership in their organizations. The chapters also have an opportunity to be a local voice. That means we can speak up at candidate forums. We encourage people to communicate with the media on their positions, so that we're trying to work on building the culture of ethical leadership in the community. Here's an interesting thing. So we've been holding now chapter events now for 2 years. And on many occasions, we have candidates for state office or other local offices, or incumbents who are holding those positions come to our meetings. And we think that's exactly what we want to see happen, because we want to raise the question about those 4 principles on ethical leadership performance at the local level. And we think it's a good thing if you go to a chapter meeting and you're an elected official and you see people that you know are business leaders or healthcare administrators or teachers, people you know and respect in your community are concerned about ethical leadership, and it could have an influence on the way you carry your position forward once you're elected. We're also doing some things on an annual basis. We're encouraging every chapter to do this, so it's done in a local community, to run a candidate development workshop. The goal here is to try to develop the next generation of ethical leaders. Now, we're not looking at statewide positions. We're talking about helping people who are thinking about running for school board or city council. It's broken down into 3 different, the workshop is broken down into 3 different components. The first component is, it's really the nuts and bolts of how to become a candidate, make sure you can follow all the processes legally and correctly. The second part talks about some suggestions and ideas on how to build an ethical leadership platform, how to build a grassroots effort, how to get people supporting you because of your commitment to ethical leader principles, and to start to build something that can grow, if you were at some future time to grow into an opportunity to become a candidate for a larger position, that you could take that support, that grassroots support with you as a way of strengthening your base. Then the third part is we hear from 2 existing elected officials. And this last one was really good. We had Steve Doyle and Lee Nearison as the speakers. And they both talked about some things that they worked together on some bipartisan legislation. There are some things that they had done with the School to Work effort together. I really liked what Lee Nearison shared, because It's very insightful. I mean, first of all, he was one of only 4 Republicans in 2011 that did not vote for Act 10. And so that was a very controversial issue at the time. And so he was definitely voting in a different direction than his party was at that time. But they respected his reasoning. He said, I'm listening to my constituents and I'm going to stay with my decision. And he continued to serve another 7 or 8 years after that vote. But here was another thing that happened with Lee. A couple years later, his seat was targeted by the other party, and there was outside money coming in to try to run ads to try to persuade people to unelect him. He was outspent 5-1, and yet he won the election. And why was that? Well, because he had a reputation of being an ethical leader among those constituents. So when you think about, how difficult it is to overcome the problems with our electoral process, with campaign finance laws, how can you overcome the big money that's out there? Well, the answer is, if you can develop a reputation as an ethical leader and you've got people that understand that and they believe in you, they'll support you. And here's the final thing I'd like to leave with you today, and that is, above all, recognize that the most powerful tool you have is your vote. And if you look at the candidates that are out there, certainly look at their policies and make sure that you're in alignment with their policies, but look at their performance. Look at how they carry themselves in their words and actions. Are they truthful? Are they transparent with public information? Do they really work to unify the state, the country, our county, or our constituency? And how do they work to try to listen to everyone and to the best of their ability, support their entire constituency and vote accordingly? Now, here's the thing. If you're looking at going into an election and you're looking at 2 individuals and you say to yourself, I can't believe that either one is committed to those 4 principles, then here's what I suggest you do. Don't vote for either one. But do vote, because there are other positions and other issues that are on the ballot, and not voting is just another way of eroding the integrity of the American democracy, and we don't want to contribute to that. Besides, there might be some next generation leaders that are coming forward, and they deserve your vote. So I'm going to finish my remarks here now, and I would invite any questions that you have, and I can get out of this screen and there we are. Now let's take a look what we have here under chat. All right, I'm going to read this from Ed Bird. I'm glad to hear you mention technology as a player in the ethical dilemma. Your comments remind me of the treatise, The Obsolescence of Man by German-American philosopher Gunther Anders. He said that technology has made morality obsolete, that technology has wiped out moral and ethical considerations in our society. Your thoughts? Is that a danger? And I'm going to reduce this for now. Well, here are some thoughts on that. I don't think technology in itself is eroding our morality, but it's causing us to get drawn into something that is, we're making snap decisions, and technology is accelerating everything that we're doing, and we're making a lot of bad decisions as a result of that. It also creates a sense of anonymity and powerlessness that we, the internet is too big, and there's too many things that are happening that we can't control or can't influence. And so all of those things can put us in a position where we choose to sit on the sidelines on things that we should be standing up and speaking out against. I do believe Section 230, the federal law and Section 230 is giving tremendous latitude for social media companies. The intent was to protect them from lawsuits if there was false information that was promoted. Well, that might appear to be a good thing. But there are also good questions about whether or not there should be some expectations and considerations for what is honest and truthful that they're promoting. And should there be standards? Should there be the kind of standards? By the way, standards could take the form of in the form of laws, and they could be professional standards. They could be associated with their occupations as internet designers and developers. There's lots of different ways to approach those issues. We should be raising questions about that so that we have a better way of trying to slow down the process, at least our own personal role in the process, to make sure that we're not unintendedly or with little thought contributing to unethical behavior. This one is from Maureen, and the presentation be available on the website, and thinking especially of the contacts listed to verify facts. Yes, it will. And the video will be on there, but also if you go onto the website, the Citizens Guide, the handbook is on there already, and so you can get information from them, from that source. Here's a question that we heard prior to the session, and that is that we often are asked the question, well, how do you expect to change this? I mean, is this unrealistic that you can raise expectations and you can have ethical leadership? And you know, I think back to an experience I had many years ago when I was a freshman in college. And I recall when I was sitting in psychology class and I'm listening to the professor give his lecture, and I'm sitting there, and on my left hand I have a portable ashtray, and on my right hand I have a cigarette, and I'm chain smoking. And I was not the only one. I can tell you, there were plenty of people in that classroom smoking at that time. The air was blue. Now, you think about that today, and you think, well, that's like a foreign world. How could that have happened then? Well, here's the thing. The change process in that single example didn't happen in one piece of legislation, and it didn't happen overnight. If you think about it, there were laws, there were organizations started putting together policies and practices, and we got more information on the health problems associated with smoking, and all of those things over many years became a part of the change process. And if we think, and there are other examples, if you look back in that same time frame, there are other examples of issues that were so different in years past, and yet we've changed them. We have to look at this issue of expecting ethical leadership in the same way. Think about all those professions where we expect and we receive ethical leadership. And we have to ask ourselves, what can we do to try to change that? Why should there be one occupation, one profession that is exempt from those expectations? And how can we bring about more awareness? So I think that we should have reason to be hopeful, but we should also be realistic that it's going to take time and it's going to take persistence. And with a collective effort can bring about those results. Are there any other questions? Well, one of the things we pledge to always do is if we post a meeting to last an hour, we don't go past 1 hour. We value and appreciated we value your time and appreciated taking time out today. If you have any questions, you can always contact me. either through the website or through LeaderEthics-Wi@gmail.com. And thank you so much for your attendance. Oh, we have one more question for everyone. Well, I'm going to answer this question this way. Think about those 4 principles and think about a crisis that we have right now. And think about how important it is to have our leaders, federal leaders, state leaders, local leaders, give truthful information, factual information about the pandemic and the impact it's having, it could have. Think about how important it is that they are transparent with public information. And this is really challenging because, as you know, in this crisis, things have really evolved over time. And so some of the factual statements that you might make today might evolve and be different at some time in the fairly near future, but ethical leaders will acknowledge that and be as straightforward as they can be. It's really important that we unifiers. We really need to pull together. And that means that we should not pick sides with our constituents. It's important to have protect the health of all our constituents. It's important to have a strong economy. All of those things go hand in hand, and we shouldn't be picking sides. So I think there's a lot of other things to look at, but I would suggest just look at those 4 principles and ask yourself, are we seeing that now? Could we be seeing more or better? And what could we do when we're facing the next crisis? Okay, this time I'm going to sign out for sure. Thank you again. Best wishes.